Welcome to the Common Man Football Show. My name is James Coburn, and today's episode, we're doing a question submitted by a bunch of different people, but I'm going to start with Eric Comas, Packers secondary receivers, and I figured I would do receivers. I like receivers a little bit more. Secondary, there's just way too many guys to go through. I do like doing these videos, at least with positional players. It's just that sometimes it gets a little ridiculous in terms of like cornerbacks or safety. Yeah. So, and also I did a article with an individual about the Packers secondary, and I'll actually link the article in the description. But we're going to get through all the Packers wide receivers, and I do understand why you would want to do this because honestly, it's kind of shaky. There is a lot of talent. I will say that much. Before we get into all the wide receivers, there is a lot of talent. They do have a particular type of wide receiver that they kind of gravitate towards. Wide receivers that typically aren't like these physical freaks. Like they would never really want to like spend a first rounder on a wide receiver. I think that's pretty much. I don't think it's like a mandate or anything. I just know that what most people commonly say, at least all the wide receivers I'm going to be talking about today, none of these guys are first-round wide receivers. Some of them weren't even really drafted. I think so. Yeah, some of them weren't even drafted. So they don't really have hang-ups when it comes to that. They have a particular type of wide receiver that they like. Usually it's productive ones for the most part. And they do kind of experiment a bit with guys that are athletic, and they'll take their shots. Shooters got to shoot, but for the most part, they do have certain guys in mind when it comes to what they want at the position. When it comes to the West Coast offense, everything else like that. So I figured I would go through all the wide receivers on the team right now. We're going to look at what their college data looks like when it comes to their production in college, what they may say about them in the NFL. We're also going to look at their athleticism data coming out of college and seeing if there's anything there to point in any particular direction. And on top of that, we're also going to look at how they did in the NFL at this point, and if there's anything that they've done thus far that could point to any clues about what they might do in the future with some players in particular. So we're going to go through the majority of the wide receiver core. We're going to get through all the big names like Jordy Nelson and Randall Cobb and DaVante Adams and guys like that. And we're also going to get into guys like Geronimo, Allison, and, Jeff Janis and all that kind of stuff. So we'll get to all that stuff. So if you are not familiar with the work that I do, I'm going to be posting the terms and definitions in the description. So if you're not familiar with athleticism data, if you're not familiar with offensive production data, any of the terms that I use today that you're not very familiar with, just go to the description. I'll have the definitions in the description. If you still don't really understand what I'm saying, leave a comment below if you have any questions about what I'm doing. But I'm basically just presenting you, what their production looked like in college, what they may say about them in the future, what their athleticism looked like in college, what they may say about them in the future as well. And then, of course, what they've actually done in the NFL. So let's get this started. Let's go through all the wide receivers in terms of their profiles and get to some conclusions about what this wide receiver core might look like in 2017. So starting with Jordy Nelson, by far, I think he's the best wide receiver in the group. Based on production, based on a lot of different factors, but just based on passing yards, market share production. Jordy Nelson had a 95.61 passing yards market share production score. Based on my data, going all the way back to 1969, 85 or higher has been the 5-time All-Pro threshold. So the majority of 5-time All-Pro wide receivers since 1969 had at least 85 or higher. 3-time All-Pro wide receivers were 80 or higher. 3-time Pro Bowl wide receivers were 68 or higher, and then long-term starters were 58 or higher. Jordy Nelson pretty much hit every single threshold. So he pretty much hits all the thresholds indicative of a 5-time All-Pro wide receiver to 3-time All-Pro type to Pro Bowler to, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So from the very get-go, his production profile looked to be pretty intriguing based on his data. And his athleticism data wasn't that bad either. I think people really underestimate or kind of underrated Jordy Nelson based on his athleticism data. He had a 55.88 explosive lower body strength score, a 78.77 speed score, and a 61.92 flexibility score. Based on my data since 1999, wide receivers really only need one 54 or higher athleticism trait. So they only need one of these. They either need to be above average when it comes to their explosiveness, above average when it comes to their speed, or above average when it comes to their flexibility. And as you can clearly see with Jordy Nelson, he's above average in every single trait. He pretty much meets the 54 or higher area with explosiveness, speed, and flexibility. So he really didn't have any sort of deficiencies when it comes to his athleticism coming out. He wasn't an amazing athlete. I mean, he's not going to win any Spark Awards, based on his data, but he is above average. And again, that you really only need to be above average to be a really good wide receiver in the NFL based on the data. And I've done tons of videos on this, whether it's Antonio Brown or Anquan Boldin, you name it. You just need to have above average athleticism traits, and at least with Jordy Nelson, he does. Which brings us to his actual NFL production. So far in Jordy Nelson's career, it's been pretty dang good. It took him a little bit of time to actually start to be really productive. His actual breakout year, if you want to call it that, was at age 26 when he had a 90 percentile plus season at age 26. But he's pretty much made up for it in 2013, 2014, and 2016. Of course, he missed 2015 because of issues, injuries. But when it comes to Jordy Nelson overall, there isn't really anything to really point out or go goo gaga over. He's been really productive. He's done what he needs to do. I do think that there is some questions about age. Because, this happens all the time. Lots of people talk about wide receiver age, and they say, well, so-and-so wide receiver is going to be a bust because of his age. And, they say once you hit age 30, everything goes downhill. And while that is true for defensive players and, those types of guys, I don't necessarily think it's true for wide receivers. And what I mean by that is when you look at Jordy Nelson, for the most part, when it comes to wide receivers, they peak at age 31. This is basically average market share scores for wide receivers that are productive. So we're not talking about guys that aren't productive or had an injury and all that kind of stuff, because injuries definitely factor into things. And I think that's the only sort of worry with a guy like Jordy Nelson is his injury history. But if you just factor all that stuff out and you actually look at the guys that actually get onto the football field and perform, age 31 is typically when a wide receiver peaks, but they don't really have a major downfall in their production until age 35. And even then, they don't really have another steep off the map. They don't actually hang up their cleats, if you will, until about age 38 to 39 is really where they kind of fall off a cliff production-wise. So I think in Jordy Nelson's case, as the biggest sort of question mark or issue with him in the future is realistically health. If he stays healthy, he could be productive well into his 30s. He could be fairly as productive as he was prior to 2016. Based on his data, especially based on his passing yardage and market share production data, especially in the fact that he's in an offense with Aaron Rodgers. There's so many things pointing towards good things with Jordy Nelson. So as much as people want to say be doom and gloomy with him and say, well, he's 31, so it's all downhill from here, based on the age data, I kind of disagree with that. He's definitely going to have a decline. I mean, I would expect somewhat of a decline from his production in 2016. So essentially, like I don't expect him to be hitting like 98 plus percentile market share data in the future. Like I don't really think that's in store for him. But could he continue to be a 90 plus percentile guy in the future? Yeah, I think it's very possible. I think he's in the right situation to do that. And I don't think there's anything that's really going to hold him back from reaching those sort of goals for him. So that's the only thing I would say about Jordy Nelson is that overall, very productive player coming out of college, very good in terms of athleticism data, and has so far had a really good NFL career up to this point. And I don't really see anything pointing towards slowing down except for injury factors. So again, if he has another injury that just basically takes him out, yeah, he probably may not be able to be productive throughout his career. But when you factor out the injury issue, when you factor that stuff out, he still has a pretty good shot of being productive well into his 30s, all the way up until probably about age. Again, usually wide receivers start to have another little decline at age 35. After 35 is when they actually start to have a fairly decent decline, and then it's pretty much, they're done pretty much at age 38 to 39. They're pretty much done playing football for the most part. So that's all I can really say about Jordy Nelson. Really good profile, just some issues here and there with other sort of factors. Then, of course, we get to Randall Cobb. When it comes to Randall Cobb's profile, hit a 76.77 passing yards market share production score. Not as good as Jordy Nelson, of course. He does hit the 3-time Pro Bowl threshold, though, which I think is, it's a pretty good threshold to be in. He just doesn't quite hit the 3-time All-Pro or 5-time All-Pro threshold when it comes to production, which basically makes him kind of like an Emmanuel Sanders type than a special wide receiver, or Jeremy Maclin type. I think that's really what Cobb has really always been. So he's a guy who has fairly decent upside based on production coming out. He just didn't really have like that special Hall of Fame type potential based on his production coming out of college. And then when you get to his athleticism data, he did hit a high quality athleticism trait. He had a 69.99 speed score. Which again, based on my data from 1999, you only need to have one 54 or higher athleticism trait to become a multiple Pro Bowl or All-Pro type. And Cobb had one. He had one speed score that was above average. So he pretty much hit every single sort of athleticism. He hit at least one athleticism trait that is necessary to be a above average starter. Below average explosiveness, below average flexibility. People may want to make more out of that than what it really is, but I don't really see that. I think, he has one above average trait that's really all you need, and, he pretty much, coming out, in his draft class in particular, he would have been graded as a Pro Bowl potential wide receiver, based on all the data that is available at this point. And then to actually get to his NFL production, he's been kind of... he's been kind of okay. He definitely has had his fair share of injury issues. He had 2 seasons of 90 percentile plus production in 2012 and 2014, but he hasn't exactly been as good as Jordy Nelson. So that's really all I'm really saying. I think Cobb, if it wasn't for health stuff, I think Cobb could still go on to become like a multiple Pro Bowl type based on his production in college. But again, I just don't see him becoming a special sort of wide receiver prospect. Based on his data out of college. I just think that's just kind of my opinion based on the data. So Cobb, I definitely think is a good wide receiver. I think he's a good guy to have in your wide receiver core because of what he brings to the table in terms of speed. But definitely health has become something that's kind of drug his profile down a bit because if you're not healthy, you're not producing. And I think that's the only sort of issue that he's had in his career thus far. And then when you get to another wide receiver, DaVante Adams, which this is a guy that I get a lot of questions about in general from Packer people, is DaVante Adams, is he going to break out finally? How long is it going to take? Stuff like that. And DaVante Adams is kind of in the same boat as Randall Cobb. He has a 79.03 passing yardage market share production score. As you can see, that doesn't quite hit the 3-time All-Pro threshold, although I would say it is in the margin of error. So he's not completely out of discussion to hit that potential. It's just that he's a little bit off. So again, the majority of guys hit 3-time All-Pro end up with 80 or higher. The majority. So there might be a guy here or there who hits that mark who didn't quite hit that sort of threshold. And DaVante Adams is close enough that I could give it to him. He has a potential. I would stick more towards the 3-time Pro Bowl threshold, at least if I'm being really, really strict. But I do think that there's a little bit of leeway because of how close he is at that 80 sort of mark. Then when you get to his athleticism traits, Adams is by far probably one of the more athletic wide receivers on the team. Overall, he has a 95.75 explosive lower body strength score, 80.40 speed score, and an 84.48 flexibility score. So he pretty much has 3 athleticism traits that hit the sort of threshold that you need to have. You only need to have 1 athletic score, again, to be a high-quality NFL wide receiver, and he has 3. He could make it with explosiveness, speed, or flexibility. So in general, he's a good athlete across the board. His production, on the other hand, has not really been that amazing. He's definitely has sort of been a wait-and-see type of wide receiver. It took him until age 24 to really have a breakout season, but it wasn't that bad either. He hit the 80 percentile range at age 24, and this is where I bring out sort of that age data, not age data specifically, but just the era data. The reason why I collect all the wide receiver performances of NFL wide receivers since 1969 is because of this right here. Based on DaVante Adams at age 24 and how he performed in passing yardage market share production sort of data, this is where he kind of landed. So these are all the wide receivers at age 24 who produced in a similar fashion to DaVante Adams when it comes to their market share yardage score. And take note of the names. It's not a bad group of players to be around, to be honest. The majority of them are starters. Even the guys that are below them, guys like Ricky Prohl and Drew Pearson from Dallas and Rob Moore, these are actually pretty dang good wide receivers. Ricky Prohl and, of course, Antonio Freeman as well, who you might be familiar with as a Packer fan. And when you actually look at Antonio Freeman's career, from 1995, he was actually worse than Adams. Then 24, he finally had sort of a breakout year in the 80 percentile range. And then from age 25 to 26, he had a major sort of breakout. Basically, he ended up in the 90 percentile range plus. Will that happen with DaVante Adams? Who knows? I'm not going to make the parallel and say that DaVante Adams is the second coming of Antonio Freeman. I'm not really going to do that. However, I would say that there's enough positives in his profile. There's enough positives on paper with Adams that I do think that he could take another step. His production from college was good enough to suggest a wide receiver with the potential to become a high-quality NFL wide receiver. He hasn't quite lived up to that hype yet, but I would not be surprised at all if he was able to take another step and turn in sort of an Antonio Freeman type of career. Again, and I know you're like, well, hold on, you're saying he's the next Antonio Freeman? No, I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying that is there's some potential that could be the case. There's also some potential that he could end up being Fair Hooker, from Cleveland, or Dave Williams from I think the Arizona St. Louis Cardinals, or Jacquez Green from Tampa Bay. There's that potential as well, but I am saying is that there's more success in here than there is failure. So I do think that DaVante Adams will at the very least start to put in another big season this year. That's my hope. He has the athleticism, he has the production. It's just a matter of what he does in the rest of his career, of course. Then we get to the other wide receivers. These are the other guys. The guys that nobody pays attention to are the guys that have really, really small fan bases. One guy in particular is Jeff Janis, and I want to get him out of the way because Jeff Janis is by far the most athletic wide receiver on the Green Bay Packers. If you look at his data, he has a 91.98 explosive lower body strength score, 97.91 speed score, and a 99.48 flexibility score. The only issue with Jeff Janis is I have virtually no data to use when it comes to production. He did not play in the FBS, and because of that, I really can't say either way about him based on his production. So he did produce fairly well in the FCS. I mean, he had at least a 90-plus percentile plus production score at the FCS level. I've not done enough work at the FCS level to really feel comfortable projecting guys with data from that level of competition. But I can say that there was some positives there. He does have ridiculous athleticism traits. I mean, this is kind of why the Packers took him. They're taking a chance, and also because he's a guy that's kind of from that neck of the woods, so to speak. He's not 100% from there, but he's from that neck of the woods. And based on his production, he just hasn't really got it done. From 2014 to 2016, 2014 and 2016 were the only 2 seasons where he actually put up enough data to really have him recorded down. And he just didn't really do that well, below average across the board when it comes to his production. So I wouldn't expect too many things from Jeff Janis at this point. I mean, there is a chance he could break out. I mean, when you're that athletic, anything could happen. But I do think that he's a guy that I would kind of say is less likely to be successful, especially in a wide receiver core where I already went over 3 wide receivers. Like Jordy Nelson, DaVante Adams, and Randall Cobb are 3 guys who all have legitimate, FBS production with athleticism traits that, the necessary athleticism traits to be very good or at least decent or above average. So I think Jeff Janis just has a ton of competition, and I would be very surprised if he was able to fight through that to actually turn into a stable guy, which I hope he does. I mean, I'm rooting for him, obviously, because he is kind of a fun player based on his athleticism profile. But I just wouldn't put too much hope into him at this point based on his below-average production up at this point. Then we get to Geronimo Allison. Allison, of course, was kind of a guy who kind of came out of nowhere, and people were like, oh my gosh, this guy's amazing. But based on his data, I mean, there's reasons why people didn't really put as much stock into him overall. Starting with his production data, he only had a 66.16 passing yardage market share production score since 1969. Based on my data, he doesn't hit the 5-time All-Pro, 3-time All-Pro, or 3-time Pro Bowl level, but he does hit the long-term starter threshold. And again, guys, I try to be as stable as possible to say that Geronimo Allison has a very legitimate chance of becoming a long-term starter in this team. I don't think he's going to become a high-quality starter, like a Pro Bowler or All-Pro type, or, again, a multiple Pro Bowl type, a multiple All-Pro type. I don't really think that that's in the cards for Geronimo Allison, but he does at least have the potential to become a long-term starter. The other thing that I think kind of negates his high-quality ability is his athleticism. Only had a 31.54 explosive lower body strength score, 7.18 speed score, and 4.87 flexibility score. He does not have a single 54 or higher athleticism score coming out of college. And I would say that because of the combination of not having the production hitting high-quality outcomes, and because he doesn't have the athleticism indicative of a high-quality NFL player, I don't quite think that he will ever become that type of player based on the data. But do I think he could become a long-term starter? Absolutely. I think there is definitely a chance he could continue to be a productive contributor in this offense, in the Packers offense. I think that's definitely a possibility. And I just don't think that he could become a guy that can become a featured player and, put in tons of, I just don't see that with him. I don't think he'll reach the heights of a Jordy Nelson or a Randall Cobb or even a DaVante Adams even. I just don't think that he has that kind of potential based on his athleticism and also based on his production. And then his production in the NFL even was not really that great when you actually look at his NFL production. It was below average across the board, which some of that's because he didn't start a ton, but still he not a very good sort of rookie season, despite the fact of the flashes. And then when you get to the last player on the team, Trevor Davis, I kind of wanted to get this guy out of the way just because he's another guy that people kind of ask me about occasionally. And Based on his production, he had a 25.42 passing yards market share production score. This is the one guy who's probably the least productive wide receiver on the team. And again, you might be asking, oh, well, James, how does he have such a low passing yards market share production score? Well, because it's passing yards market share production. He played in an offense that had a high amount of passing yardage, and he was a very small contribution to that overall offense. And again, if you're a very small contributor, if you barely contribute at all in an offense, and how do you expect this guy to become a major contributor in an NFL offense? So that's really my only sort of question mark when it comes to guys that produce this low. And this is a legitimate concern. I mean, he didn't hit the 5-time All-Pro threshold, didn't hit the 3-time All-Pro, 3-time Pro Bowl, or even long-term starter threshold. The majority of long-term NFL starters were at least 58 or higher when it comes to their passing yards market share production, with only a handful of guys below that threshold. And most of the guys that are close to Trevor Davis are guys that didn't even play wide receiver in college that much. Guys like Julian Edelman, who was a quarterback in college. Antoine Randall, who was mostly a quarterback in college. So Trevor Davis is just not in a very good place when it comes to his production to consider him to be a long-term starter. And then when you look at his athleticism data, which is probably the main reason why he was drafted, he does have some good positives in terms of athleticism. Of course, has a 53.11 explosive lower body strength score, 60.03 speed score, and a 78.34 flexibility score. But despite that, his production just continues to take precedent over all the sort of positive in terms of his athleticism data. So again, you have to look at everything in concert. You have to look at the big picture with a guy like this. So even though he does have some positive athleticism traits, his production was indicative of someone who would not become a long-term starter. So again, when you have a player where one thing says they're going to be good and another thing says they're not going to be good, and it's also a thing where, as I've showed with other things in the past, passing yards market share data trumps athleticism a lot of times. Like with guys like Antonio Brown and Anquan Bolden, those were guys that were very productive in terms of passing yards market share data, didn't have the best athleticism, and they ended up trumping the data, trumping everybody. So I think that when it comes to Trevor Davis, there's not a lot of precedent for a guy like this. There's not a lot of precedent for a guy who's just a great athlete who wasn't productive to become a really good NFL player as a wide receiver in the last years, with the exception of a handful of dudes. And like I said, most of the dudes at his production level were guys that didn't even play the position in college, particularly quarterbacks that turned into wide receivers. So with Trevor Davis, I kind of see a guy who's mostly going to be a backup to contributor, but not a guy I would ever really consider to become a long-term starter on the team in the future. And that kind of backs up what he actually did as a rookie with very low production across the board in 2016. So overall, one of my impressions of the Green Bay Packers wide receiver group, I think it's a pretty solid group. Jordy Nelson, I think, is going to continue to be the guy. I mean, if he stays healthy, I think he's going to be a major contributor in this offense. He's going to continue to be the best wide receiver in the offense, no matter what Randall Cobb does, no matter what DaVante Adams does. I still think that Jordy Nelson is going to become he's going to continue to be the best wide receiver on this team when it comes to production and just everything else in general. But I do think that because you have a guy like Jordy Nelson and because you have a guy like Randall Cobb, if he's healthy, and also because you have a guy like DaVante Adams, I do think that leaves lots of possibilities for this offense in the future, on top of guys like Geronimo, Allison, Jeff Janis, and Trevor Davis, who they do have some warts, they do have some things that are a little bit off about them, but I do think that they could still be very good contributors. I still think that they could, give some positive things, and it would not surprise me to see a guy like Geronimo Allison, become a long-term starter. It's possible he could become that type of guy. He could become a slot wide receiver in this offense and produce. I just don't think that he'll become as good as Jordy Nelson. I don't think that should be expected of him. I think that's kind of rude, I guess is the only word I could say. But I do think that, in general, it's a good wide receiver group. They don't have any legitimate, they don't have a Calvin Johnson. They don't have a Julio Jones. They don't have anything like that, with the exception of Jeff Janis. who's kind of a really, really good, wide receiver athlete, but just hasn't really done much of anything so far. But I do think it's a very solid group. They have a type of wide receiver. They typically go for production. I mean, as I went through all the wide receivers with the exception of Trevor Davis, were above average productive. Every single one of them were above average productive when it comes to market share data. So they do tend to put some looks into production. They do put some stuff into athleticism, believe it or not. Now, I can't say for sure. I mean, sure, there is some exceptions. Guys like Geronimo, Allison, of course, who was below average in athleticism and everything. But then again, they didn't really draft Geronimo Allison day 2 either. So they do tend to get wide receivers who are at least somewhat athletic when it comes to their data. But other than that, I mean, they're on the right track. They're looking for the right guys, if you will. I think there could be some improvements. I think guys like DaVante Adams is just a question mark because of, this is going to be a pivotal year for DaVante Adams, for his career. If he continues to be just kind of middling in terms of production, then I think you might move on from him. But if he doesn't, if he has a big breakout year this year, which I hope that's what happens, then I think there's lots of good things that could happen with a guy like him. Same thing with Randall Cobb, if he could stay healthy, and all those other guys could stay healthy, I think a lot of good things can happen. And that's really the big thing. A lot of these wide receivers have just had health issues. Jordy Nelson's missed seasons because of health issues. Randall Cobb has missed many games because of health issues. A lot of these guys have had different sort of ailments here and there, and I think that's really held them back. But I do think it's a pretty solid group. I think there's lots of possibilities here, and I think it's going to continue to be pretty dang good in the future. So again, my name is James Coburn. You can find my work at draftcoburn.wordpress.com. You can also follow me on Twitter at Geometrics. And if you like this content and you want more content like this, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. Share this video as well with anybody that you know, and I will talk to you guys in the next video. Peace.